All right, so let's talk about types of disaster risks. Okay, so I'm Cecile Manchero Guchano, and I'll be teaching you about these types of disaster risks. So, disaster risk is the potential loss of life, injury, or destroyed or damaged assets which could occur to a system, society, or community in a specific period of time, determined probabilistically as a function of hazards. So, what are these hazards? Let's review this natural hazards. So hazards can be described as natural hazard, and these different types of natural hazards are geophysical, something about the earth, like earthquakes, landslides, and volcanic activity. They can be hydrological, something about the water, like floods and avalanches. Something climatological, like something relating to the climate, such as droughts and wildfires. Something meteorological, relating to weather conditions, such as cyclones and storms. And it can be biological, such something about exposure to living organisms and toxic substances or diseases, or may cause diseases, and may carry, such as disease epidemics and insect or animal plagues. And hazards can also be man-made or technological hazards, such as it can be complex emergencies like conflicts, wars, industrial accidents, transport accidents, like car accidents, environmental degradation, and pollution caused by humans. So disaster risk, determined probabilistically as hazards, exposure. Okay, so disasters can happen depending if a community or a person is exposed to danger or to these hazards. So in this photo, like I showed an example of a hut made from wood, from very sensitive material at the beach. So if a typhoon or an or tidal or very dangerous waves, like tidal waves happen, that house would be exposed to uh, uh, different factors that may damage the house. So the exposure to situation of people, infrastructure, housing, production capacities, and other tangible human assets located in hazard-prone areas. So islands, tropical beaches, such as places that's near the ocean, is hazard-prone areas, especially with the fast change of climate change, very rapid climate change. And measures of exposure can include the number of people or types of assets in an area. So this can be combined with the specific vulnerability and capacity of the exposed elements to any particular hazard to estimate the quantitative risk associated with that hazard in the area of interest. That's okay. So, and disaster risk can also happens depending on the vulnerability. So, vulnerability of a person. So, the condition determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increases susceptibility of an individual, a community, assets, or systems to the impact of hazards. So, for example, a beggar, especially someone who is handicapped, is more vulnerable to disasters than a person who is bodily able, has complete has his or her or their complete limbs, and who have their own home. So yes. So I would just like to read this. So the definition of disaster risk reflects the concept of hazardous events and disasters as the outcome of continuously present condition of risk. Disaster risk comprises different types of potential losses, which are often difficult to quantify. Nevertheless, with knowledge of the prevailing hazards and the patterns of population and socioeconomic development, disaster risk can be assessed and mapped, in broad terms at least. Okay, so meaning that even with the danger of disaster risk, communities, governments, the people, uh, associations can assess and map out possibility of disaster risk so that we could prevent it. So it is important to consider the social and economic context in which disaster risk occur, and the people do not necessarily share the same perception of risk and the underlying risk factors. Okay, so let's go to the different types of disaster risk types. There's only five. Let's go to the first one, which is acceptable risk or tolerable risk. If you could read all of this, the whole idea of this definition is that uh, a place that experiences disaster, however, it only is affected. This is only like minimal uh, damage. Okay, so it's like there's a place that is acceptable, that when disasters come, there's on the place only experiences acceptable risk or tolerable risk. Like the people can move on with their lives even if disaster happens. So let me just read the definition na lang. Is acceptable risk or tolerable risk is therefore an important subterm. The extent to which a disaster risk is deemed acceptable or tolerable depends on existing social, economic, political, cultural, technical, and environmental conditions. In engineering terms, acceptable risk is also used to assess and define the structural and non-structural measures that are needed in order to reduce possible harm to people, property, services, and systems to a chosen tolerated level, according to the codes or accepted practice, which are based on known probabilities of hazards and other factors. So, for example, in the photo, like there are some dome homes or communities here in the Philippines, and one of these dome home communities are in, I think this is in Dapitan, if I'm not wrong, or in Mindoro. Um, so so there's dome homes. So these dome homes are actually uh, very strong when it comes to earthquakes and typhoons. So in this photo, this is actually a screenshot from a video where the old lady explained that the damage in her community, damage the what is this the plants, the trees are the only things you can see that are a bit damaged because of Typhoon Nona. Because it is during Typhoon Nona during 2015. In year 2015, when Typhoon Nona affected Mindoro, or was it Dapitan? Or maybe in Dapitan, Mindoro, I'm not sure. So, yeah, so it's acceptable risk that the plants and the trees were affected, but not the homes. Therefore, the people are safe within their dome homes. Okay, and there's also a picture here that, you know, it's just some trees that fell, branches, and then the people just move on with their lives because, the community or the government have thought about the disasters that might happen, and they have made improvements in the homes of the community, or in their infrastructures, or in the way, was that in the even infrastructures in public places, or even the places where the cars hap will drive by, that only there are not too much trees. If you can see in the photo, there are not much too much trees in the middle of the street. It's just like a protective uh was like a protective steel there. It's only in the middle. So yeah, so they have prepared. So the community, the government, the community leaders have prepared to make sure that there's not a lot of risks when typhoons or earthquakes or other natural disasters that might happen. There are not a lot of, uh, there'll be minimal effects in their community if natural disasters will happen. Okay, so let's go to the next type, which is residual risk. So residual risk is a disaster risk that remains even when the effective disaster risk reduction measures are in place, of which emergency response and recovery capacities must be maintained. The presence of residual risk implies a continuing need to develop and support effective capacities for emergency services, preparedness, response, and recovery, together with socio-economic policies such as safety nets and risk transfer mechanisms as part of a holistic approach. So here in Wikipedia it says a residual risk is the amount of risk or danger associated with an action or event remaining after natural or inherent risk have been reduced by risk controls. So residual risk equals to inherent risk minus impact of risk controls. So example D of residual risk is given by the use of automotive seatbelts. Installation and use of seatbelts reduces the overall severity and probability of injury in an automotive accident. However, probability of injury remains when in use that remain the of residual risk. So, an example of residual risk based on the definition is that uh, in car accidents, sure that this person here, this man, has his seatbelt on. However, he still experienced injuries. So that's a residual risk. So it's something like uh, people have done so much to prevent danger or risk, yet there is still some residual risk that resulted, no matter how much the people have tried to prevent any risks. Okay, so the third one is intensive disaster risk. So the risk associated with high severity, mid to low frequency events, mainly associated with major hazards. So, according to UNDRR, intensive disaster risk is the risk of high severity, mid to low frequency disasters, mainly associated with major hazards. So, intensive disaster risk is mainly a characteristic of large cities or densely populated areas. They're not only exposed to intense hazards such as strong earthquakes, active volcanoes, heavy floods, tsunamis, or major storms, but also have high levels of vulnerability to these hazards. So, examples. Okay, there's another slide about. Wait, no, not yet. So, mid to low frequency disasters. So, these are like events, disasters that don't usually happen, but they happen in large cities or densely populated areas that are not usually exposed to intense hazards. Okay. So these are places. Example, natural disaster risk are places that don't usually experience disasters, that don't usually experience earthquakes, active volcanoes, heavy floods, tsunamis, or major storms. But they are also vulnerable to these hazards. But they are very vulnerable to these hazards. For example, like uh, Butuan City, right? So we are exposed, but not all the time, by typhoons. But not all the time. It's usually like our neighboring places. Okay, so next is extensive disaster risk. So the risk of low severity, high frequency hazardous events and disasters, mainly but not exclusively associated with highly localized hazards. So example like extensive disaster risk is usually high where communities are exposed to and vulnerable to recurring localized floods, landslides, storms, and drought. So excessive disaster risk is often exacerbated by poverty, urbanization, and environmental degradation. So these are examples like locations like Leyte and Surigao that are repeatedly hit with earthquakes and typhoons. So these are urbanized places, and these places usually these places are also known to have some uh, locations where there are poor people, where there's poverty, is very urbanized, and there's a degradation environment because these places are also very known to have mining locations. That's why they're usually recurring natural disasters here in these places. Okay. And then the last one is natural disaster risk. Now I could read all of this, and I think okay, let's read it first before I could summarize. So, intensive and extensive disaster risks that either have a potential or cumulative impact that is significant and relevant for the nation as a whole and/or require national DRM coordination. DRM means disaster risk management. So, the boundaries of national disaster risk depends on purpose and scoping of an NDRA process. This national disaster risk assessment. This has to be defined in each country, taking into account existing governance and DRM policies. DRM is disaster risk management. So national disaster risk at least include all risks that cannot be sufficiently managed at subnational level. So when national disaster risk is when intensive and extensive disaster risk happen nationally in a country. That's why there's a uh, needed uh, DRM and DRA process nationally. So So mandates, incentives, capacities, and measures happens nationally. Okay. So DRM is application of disaster risk reduction policies, processes, and actions to prevent new risks, reduce, and manage existing disaster risks, thereby contributing to the strengthening resilience. Okay. So national disaster risk. Uh, Risk or natural disaster. For example, like typhoons. I think there is a time in the Philippines where there were typhoons was happening in different places, like in Luzon and Visayas at the same time in Mindanao. So that's national disaster risk. Okay, so that's it. That's the end of the lesson, and these are the sources and contents and images that I used for this presentation. Okay, so that's all, and thank you for listening.